Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness, and Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about shame. Shame, yes. Brene Brown has done lectures, talks on this. Yeah, it's a great topic. So, Donovan, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to shame?
Oh, let's see. This is one that I'm maybe not as familiar with, as opposed to other emotions, just because it's not one that I have felt a ton or have had necessarily personal problems with. But the first thing that sort of comes to mind is shame and sort of guilt, and maybe we can play out like those two concepts and how they're different and how they're the same. Because I don't know that I'm super clear on that off the top of my head, but I imagine there is some important nuance there. So, not a very useful starting, but those are my first thoughts.
Well, when it comes to shame, for me, I think it's sort of ingrained in the Asian culture. It's kind of part of like your upbringing. I think Asian culture and maybe like Jewish culture, it's all about shame, shaming and making you feel like you're not good enough. And what comes to mind initially, like things that have felt shameful about in my life, particularly, is not being able to speak Chinese, even though I was born in California. But if I run across like another Chinese person and they're like, start talking to me in Chinese, and I say, oh, I don't speak Chinese, there's that look of like, ooh, you should be ashamed of yourself. Your parents should be ashamed of themselves. Like that look. And, I think when I was younger, it might have bothered me a lot more. And now I've just kind of accepted that, people will have their opinions and it doesn't affect me and it doesn't make the difference. And I've built up my self-worth over the years too. So that has helped significantly. But that's like the initial incident of like shame, or not getting good grades. There's shame around that. Like you're not good enough. I think it's just kind of like they don't really celebrate your victories. Like when you get an A, it's like, oh, you did your job. But then when you do below than what you're supposed to do, there's the shame factor. Was my experience growing up. So I feel familiar with it, but I'm thankful that I haven't felt shameful in a really long time.
So, based on that, and I'll probably be asking you a lot of questions because, again, shame isn't like a feeling that's super prevalent for me. As you mentioned a lot of external factors.
Yeah.
What would you say sort of the differences, or like how would you tease apart shame as a feeling internally as opposed to like people trying to push it on you, right? Because a lot of what you said was like just these interactions where like you would be shamed, and I'm curious how that fits as opposed to just like feeling shame yourself, like if it's one to one or this. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it can go both ways. I think when I was younger, like if I had like someone be like, oh, you don't speak Chinese, and then give me the look, I would be feeling bad about myself and feeling like I'm not good enough. And just like I'm a disgrace of a nation, basically, is the experience that I have on a personal level. But I think there is a difference between the external factor, like being shamed. You can let it affect you, or you don't let it affect you. And I think it comes down to how developed you are in your own self-worth and your personal development to be able to withstand it or have resistance against it or not, essentially.
So I'd be curious if there are instances where you have felt shame that are like weren't tied to anything external at all, I guess was the question I was trying to get at, right? Because like it makes sense to me if that we'll use as Chinese example. Somebody's like, oh, you don't speak Chinese, and then you feel bad about it. Like that path makes a lot of sense to me. I'm just curious if there's more internal solo paths where you felt shame and what that experience has been like.
For me, I think it's shame around when I couldn't make a relationship work. That's also from my youth. It was, like initial thoughts are like grades typically. And then it's like not being a good enough Asian Chinese person. Then the other thing is like not being able to have a successful relationship, which I really struggled with in my 20s of getting dumped a lot of times. It was a lot of times like I didn't have the self-worth, and I couldn't even identify that my self-worth was lacking in that sense, because what I am thankful that my parents taught me is to work hard. So in a relationship, I thought if I just work harder, this should work better. And the harder that I worked, it almost like pushed them further away. Maybe it came off as needy or desperate or whatever. And so when that relationship ended, it felt like the eternal experience is like, I'm a failure. And even though I did the best that I can, like now I would be like, oh, I did the best that I can and it's okay. Not everything works out. But back then it would have been like, I'm a failure. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. All of that negative internal talk is the experience. That really just kind of sets you up for failure in your next one because you're worried about that. You're like, well, what if the same thing happens? And then you're desperate and needy again, and then the same thing does happen. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So would you say that the same thing happened when you felt shame externally, which is, let me color that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Like the way you've been talking about is like some sort of action or event or whatever happened, and then you felt shame in a way that like your character felt negative. Like you felt like your character was not good enough in some way, or in terms of like, I'm not a good person or whatever else. Did that does that map on to the same way you've experienced shame sort of externally? So like, hey, you like, I'm judging you because you can't speak Chinese or whatever.
Right.
When you felt shame, was it from those things? Was it still the same sort of like character sort of attacks on yourself?
I'd say maybe on occasion, but I would say that it was more on me than from external forces, and that honestly, I generally didn't feel shamed a whole lot. Maybe like once in a while from my parents for random silly things. But like from like friends or even most family, it just didn't seem like I could distinguish that clearly wasn't their intention, but it was just me feeling like, actually I can even remember an incident just a few years ago where I was in a leadership program and I was trying to mix certain measures for that program that I wasn't able to meet, even though I was like working so hard and trying my best to get to those measures. And so I felt like a failure. And I even like cried in front of my class because I felt like I was letting my team down in a way. But one of my coaches came up to me and she was like, you realize that there's nothing you could do that could disappoint us. That failure is like over there with you and not over here with us. And I realized that a lot of the times it is just more of my internal experience based on my own self-judgment of feeling like I'm not doing or performing well enough. I'm disappointing people. I'm a failure, like all of that negative self-talk. And it's like, doesn't even occur to the other side sometimes. So that does happen too.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of what the characteristics of shame when you end up feeling them. Now, I'm just gonna badger you with questions today, but I'd be curious what you feel like the difference is between the times you felt shame and guilt. If you can think of any like instances where you felt guilt, and then maybe like we can try to parse out the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think for my own personal experience, and this could be different for other people, my experience of shame is usually like internalized, like I did something wrong, I did something bad, versus guilt is like, oh, I hurt someone. It involves another party or person. and then it's guilt over like that, like, oh, maybe it was unintentional, like, oh, I really let this person down, like I said I was going to do this thing and maybe I forgot, and then I feel guilty, and then I feel like I have to make up for it. But I don't feel like there's shame there. It's more of like, oh man, I really let this person down, or I hurt them in some capacity. I think it involves another person. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that tracks. Again, shame isn't one that comes naturally to me, but like if I think about guilt, right? For example, playing soccer yesterday,
Yeah.
I made a poor judgment decision and ended up just like hitting someone harder than I meant to.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that like could have got someone injured potentially. It wasn't like
Yeah.
crazy bad, but I feel some guilt around that, but I don't feel any shame
Yeah.
around that. And I
Right.
think it goes back to sort of what you were saying around like or at least the distinction that we're starting to pick apart, which like I don't feel like necessarily I'm a bad person because of that. I don't feel like
Right.
oh I'm made this horrible mistake that is indicative of my character, but I do feel guilty in terms of like, oh, I should probably try to learn from this and not
Right.
um do things like this in the future. But partially like it was also a mistake too, right? Like it's partially a judgment call.
Mm-hmm.
um so I just wonder if I was more prone to sort of like internalizing those things, if guilt could quickly become shame.
Maybe.
But again, that's just not an emotion, or at least not a phrasing. I mean, maybe I have the exact same experience, but phrase it differently. But it's just not something I'm super familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking of when I feel shame, there's like the negative self-talk, but with guilt, it's just like, or with shame, I feel like I'm stewing in the shame in a way, and I'm not quite sure how to like break free from that in those darker moments. But with guilt, it's almost like I'm not so focused on myself. I'm focused on like, what can I do to make this right with this other person?
Mm.
And so it's almost like easier to get over. I don't know, it depends on how bad it is and if I can actually do something to make the situation right. Like I remember in college with my college boyfriend, he was DJing an event and I went home early, and he said to like leave the key, and I might have told this story before. He said to leave the key in the mailbox, which I forgot to do, and I don't keep my phone on volume. So my phone is usually always silent. So he gets home like pretty late at night. I'm dead asleep. He calls me like 100 times. I don't hear it because my phone's not on sound, and I forgot about the key. So he had to wait like for several hours out in the dark in the cold because I forgot this thing, and I felt so bad and so guilty. There was no shame in it, but I felt so bad that I like, to make up for it, the next day I cleaned his room to kind of like do something nice for him. And then he was like, "Oh, are you trying to make me feel bad for not having a clean room?" I was like, "No, I was trying to make up for what I did to you, and I'm sorry." So that was a definite guilt experience, but I felt like we were able to move past it. Okay, let me do something to make it right, and then we could move forward, kind of a thing.
So with some of your experiences where you've had like shame before,
Yeah.
do you feel like there's a component where like you could take an action to remedy something, or like is that not part of that experience?
I think maybe eventually it dissipates, but maybe it doesn't. Like maybe I bring that shame. Maybe I'm not as heavily focused on it, but it's still there, lingering in the background to some extent. It wasn't really until like, I mean, there are actions in that. Like I wasn't specifically like, I'm gonna go work on my shame right now. It was more like, oh, I want to work on getting better at relationships. I want to work on like improving my relationship with my father or my partner, and it was more like that was the goal, not in shame. And then what I discovered in doing that personal development work was like, oh, I need to work on me and my lack of self-worth and my internal shame factor and all that negative self-talk that comes with that. That's really like the root of all these other problems. And that took, a bit of work to discover that for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me try and run a parallel and see how
Yeah.
this feels. So, like, when you say you experience guilt and then you wanted to like do the action of um cleaning, right? To
Right.
try to
Yeah.
like make amends in some way.
Yeah.
When you felt shame, is there some sort of like, so let's say you're feeling shameful about not being able to speak Chinese.
Yeah.
Has that emotion ever like given you drive to do that thing?
No, I still don't want to learn Chinese. It more actually, if I'm shamed for it now, I'm almost like upset by them because it's like subtle racism in my head, and I put it back on them because it's like, how dare they like assume that I should be able to speak Chinese now? You wouldn't do that with like, you see a redhead and you're like, do you speak like Irish? Like, or just like make that assumption. Or if they have like an Italian last name, you're like, you must speak Italian, right? No, they don't do that if you're white. So maybe that's a subtle change in my experience now, versus back then. Maybe it was like, I still didn't even feel motivated to learn Chinese then. It was like, oh, I'm just bad. But it doesn't feel like, oh, I can improve this by learning Chinese. I was like, well, I guess I suck as an Asian. Oh, well.
Yeah, that actually maps on nicely to sort of my experience with I guess being shamed, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the second thing you said is the thing that I have just always had naturally, where it's like, if someone has some sort of passes some sort of judgment on me that I just don't find to be valid at all, and it has caused me to either just be apathetic or like angry, right? And
Yeah.
I got some of the same stuff because I have my grandma's Chinese. She likes to rattle on about some specific things in ways that she thinks I should be living my life, but never, even as a little kid, like it has always just turned into that second thing that you said. I don't know why, naturally that happened to be however my brain worked, but I think that's part of the reason that I haven't felt, sort of like this shame feeling as much, is just because being shamed for whatever reason, I've just been like, this is just a judgment. This is your own thing. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. It's more like you need like cultural sensitivity training, and they're clearly ignorant kind of a thing.
it just reminds me, I think I've told you this. I don't know if I've told this story on the actual podcast though, but
Yeah.
my grandma one time was, after I switched into software, I was just talking to her about the job and the change and stuff. And she was like, have you ever thought about going into venture capitalism? And I'm like, I just switched into software like a year or two ago.
Right.
Like, I need to get my feet under me before I even consider switching careers again. And she was like, well, I really just want to make sure that you're able to make a good living. I'm like, software jobs are like
Are pretty good.
pretty good in
Yeah.
general. Like,
Right.
and I've happened to land a couple that are like exceptionally good.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, but I really just want you to have a good living. And I'm like, Grandma, what do you mean by that? Like, what does that mean? What do you have to have a good living? And she was like, well, you probably need to make like $1 billion a year. It's like $1 billion a year.
Oh, okay.
There's only like a handful of people making a decent living in your mind. Like,
Right.
you don't need $1 billion a year to have a place to live and food to eat and be able to just take care of your bills and expenses and stuff. And that example is a little bit out there, but maybe that's why it always rolled off my back. Maybe the shames were always just like structured in a way that I was like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah. I think it's ingrained in a lot of Asian cultures of just, if you are successful, okay, whatever, you did what you're supposed to do, but you need to go for more. Obviously, that's that. And there's never like being satisfied, because it's like, oh, well, you could always be doing better. You should be doing better. And if you're doing under what like they have in their head as successful, then you're like, oh, you should be ashamed of yourself. Like how, yeah, you really need to get your act together, even though you might perfectly be living a comfortable life or something to that extent. It's ingrained. And so as I've learned that, I don't need to be making $1 million and I could be perfectly satisfied not making $1 million and I have a happy life, and I'd rather have a good work-life balance than be working 80 hours a week, honestly, to get this like weird goal in my head that, is created out of nothing really.
Yes. So on that note, I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit towards like maybe things that we could do to create a more supportive environment for people to not cause other people to feel shame.
Yeah.
And I think one example that comes to mind for me is like there are members of my family, for example, who never went to college and or never finished
Right.
and feel really shameful about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I am sure that they've gotten like negative external validation, right? Like outside sources saying that it's bad for some reason or another.
Right.
Um, but I've always found that just being able to communicate, like, I don't know, that I have no judgment in that realm
Mm-hmm.
has been helpful for them. And in the same way, I would be curious what things you've seen either that you've been able to do that reduce shame for people or things that other people have done for you that have helped you minimize shame.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind when I think of like people shaming other people is the mommy shaming. Apparently, is I'm not a parent yet, but I have so many parent friends, and yeah, I hear this constant like judgment. Maybe it's from family or friends or strangers of like how they are parenting. And I've kind of heard a lot of the shaming and how they feel shamed. And I purposely try to create a space of like, hey, your kid's alive. That's pretty awesome. You're doing the best you can. That's pretty awesome. However, whatever means you get there, that's cool. And so I try to leave a space of like, well, one, I'm not a person to judge how you're doing things because I'm not a parent yet. So who am I to say like what's the best method of doing things? And it's like, yeah, it's your family, it's your choice on how you want to go about that. So it's giving them the space. Like I give my sister space to complain about her mother on like certain judgments that get passed or other things. So that's kind of what I try to do. Be like almost a nonchalant, like, yeah, do whatever you feel like is best. That's cool.
Here's another angle. I'm going to tweak
Yeah,
it, tweak
sure.
the question a little bit. What if, okay, so in that
Mhm.
example, you're saying like, I'm not passing judgment because I don't necessarily know
Right.
what is a good path. There are many potential paths that could be good.
Mhm.
What if it's something that you know for sure that someone is doing wrong or you just like strongly
Sweet.
disagree with, right? Because I'm
Mm.
I'm guessing in a lot of instances in those parenting examples,
Mhm.
people either genuinely know things or think they know things, which is probably a
Right.
lot more
Yeah.
common about how other people should be raising kids. And there's probably like research validated ways of doing
Mhm.
things and random opinion ways of doing things. But I'd just be curious where you think, or how, I guess, you would think to approach if it's something that you actually are thinking. Maybe you're not judging them like, oh, they're a bad
Yeah.
person, but you're judging like, well, not judging, disagreeing with the actions that they're taking.
It kind of depends on if I feel like, is this hurting the child in some capacity? But then I have to take a step back. Like I just heard like a fact about Alicia. I don't know if this is fact or just gossip, and I don't mean to gossip, but I heard of something about like Alicia Silverstone like having her kid in her bed till he was 7 or something like that, and I was like, that's a pretty long time. And yeah, I even noticed my own judgment about that. But then someone mentioned how like, in a lot of cultures around the world, that's actually pretty normal. And I was like, oh, it doesn't mean it's gonna like mentally or emotionally scar them or make them too needy. It really kind of depends on the kid and their personality. So I think I try to, think about it from like other perspectives for one, and then also not be like, this is clearly the wrong way, this is gonna mentally damage your child. It's more of like, oh, what's I think bringing curiosity to it is helpful, because it's like, well, what motivates you to do this? What are the benefits that you see out of it? um how do you feel about like what other people think about this thing, because a lot of people probably do judge you, kind of a thing. Kind of bringing curiosity to the situation, I think, can help lighten the heaviness of it.
Yep, that parallels exactly basically what I would have said, just sort of you have to be confident that you understand what the other person is trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not the methods they're using to get there are
Mm-hmm.
ones you agree with or not. You have to understand like why they're doing it.
Right.
And not only that, but if you don't ask first or get a good understanding, you're not going to be able to open a conversation around like, oh, okay, what are the outcomes that you're trying to get? Oh, interesting. Like you're doing it this way. I've seen these other things, or however you want to approach that. But if you don't do that first baseline setting step, I feel like it's very unlikely to be successful and more likely to feel like you're trying to like shame them or force your sort of opinion on top of theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I did want to add how I deal with being shamed now. Another thought popped into my head about even just getting shame for being a naturopathic doctor. There's a lot of people out there that have like the wrong impression about it, think it's like hippie medicine or witchcraft or whatever. They think it's just like, they don't think it's like a legitimate thing that can help people, or they think it's like it can't do anything, or it's so extreme it will like hurt a lot of people. And it's like, picks which one. It's like it does nothing or it does like the worst thing possible. And it's like, after doing this for over a decade, I've come to not let it rolls off my back now. I mean, haters are gonna hate, and I'm like, okay, they don't fully understand it and they don't have any intention of really trying to understand it, and that's not on me to help them understand if they don't want to understand. But if they do want to understand, great, I'm willing to share and inform them and kind of share my experience. But the other thing that kind of helps me not internalize the external shame is the fact that I know that my medicine works, that I've helped hundreds and hundreds of people feel better and improve their lives and make a difference for them. So, I have tons of testimonials. So it's like they can say whatever they want. I know it works. So yeah, that's what matters at the end. So it doesn't like internally bother me so much anymore.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot more than we can say in this single
Yeah.
podcast about just how sort of shame can link up with self-esteem and
Mm-hmm.
different ways to build that and whatnot. But I've found sort of the same thing where when my self-worth was lower, again, I didn't necessarily feel it as shame,
Yeah.
but or at least not what I would describe as it, but I was much more prone to feeling like hurt or attacked
Mm-hmm.
or aggressive. For example, here's a funny one. Recently, we went out somewhere and I got a note on my car when we got back that just said learn how to park.
Oh,
And
I've
I,
seen those kinds of things. Yeah.
I and I was like, okay, I must have
Mm-hmm.
like parked badly. I don't know. I got out of the car, I looked around, and then I was like, I have no idea why I have this note on my
Mm-hmm.
car.
Yeah.
So I just crinkled it up and threw it away. It might have been different if I saw something. It was like, oh, I shouldn't do that in the future. But I was just like,
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. But in the past, like the far past, that would have been something that really sent me on mental spirals.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to go along with that, it is connected to the way that I have learned or developed to like process feedback. It falls in the same bucket, which is like once I receive feedback of some kind, and this could be some sort of shame thing too, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you don't know this specific thing. The first thing that I try to do is figure out like, is this feedback useful in terms of, is there something I can actually take out of this?
Right.
Right? Is there an action that I can do that's associated with this?
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of things, or like my other YouTube channels, there's a bunch of nasty comments on there. A lot of those things don't actually have any content that you can use to do anything.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you shouldn't be making this kind of content. You're a bad person. And it's like, okay, what are my options to learn from this? Like, I can just stop for no reason, like, or keep going. Okay. There's nothing in the message that like allowed me to pick out something that's like, here is the reason this is bad. Here's what I could potentially improve. And once I started using that sort of framework for myself implicitly of just like, what is the quality of this feedback? What is the quality of the message that's being given to me? And using that to internalize things, I did so much better, because I would also get or have gotten comments on other things that are like either more specific or at least rooted enough that I can go, oh, there's action here for me to take. And I think the reason that helped a lot with a lot of those negative feelings, hopefully maybe it could help with shame too, is because it gave me so much more control, right?
Yeah.
Before I had that, I didn't have control. So if somebody said something negative and it hurt my feelings or made me feel angry or whatever else, there was no way for me to change anything about it.
Right.
And now I can either just throw those comments in the trash or dig out some sort of action to actually take.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you can distinguish, I think a lot of us can distinguish when some people are just trying to be mean. They're not really trying to like give you criticism for you to improve. They're just being an asshole. That's some people. But then there are people that are wanting to help you succeed, and they're giving you constructive feedback so you can improve. And then you can kind of distinguish or decide like which is actually useful and beneficial. And, I think it's worthwhile, like, to not just like, oh, I'm just not even going to look at the comments altogether. They're all negative. It's like, I'm not blanket statementing that. You can learn and get better, and you might be able to get something, but you have to be willing to kind of have a tough skin and realize that part of that is dealing with the assholes or the trolls that leave that other stuff that's not as pleasant.
It is interesting too, because as you take time sort of sifting through different kinds of like comments and feedback and whatnot, you find that the same message can be delivered on a benign or asshole scale, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Like there were a number of, when I first started my other YouTube channel, there were a number of comments, just more benign comments about like, oh, the introduction is too long, and a bunch of comments about like, sarcastically like, oh, you should make the introduction longer and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting that once I was able to start parsing comments for their usefulness, right, for their content, the tone actually stopped mattering a lot. Like I stopped caring a lot because, well, I don't know why exactly, but it just made it so much easier to digest. Like wherever it was on that scale of benign to asshole didn't matter as much as what is the actual usefulness of the information in here.
Right. Yeah. I think that is really helpful. Great. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Are there any final thoughts you have, Donovan?
I don't think so. I've been all over the place on this one, so I think I'm good.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share about your shameful stories in the comments if you'd like, and help spread the happiness in the world. Thanks again. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. If you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.